We are making our way through a Lenten series called Signs Along the Way. You probably noticed on the front cover of your bulletin a road sign right there. That's not a stop sign telling you to turn around and go back. That's a crossroads, which is what we're going to be exploring here this morning. I'm not talking about Crossroads, the 2002 Britney Spears movie, much to the disappointment of some, but rather talking about crossroads in terms of turning point moments in our life. Times when things change dramatically, or times when we are faced with a fork in the road and need to decide which direction to take. It was in 2017 when I found myself in a crossroads moment like this. At that time, I was serving as the director of admissions at the Lutheran Seminary in Philadelphia. And this was a job that I absolutely loved, but unfortunately, due to some decisions far outside of my control, it became very clear that I could no longer work at that institution if I wanted to maintain my integrity. I won't go into all the gory details, that's a matter for another sermon perhaps, but after a lot of prayer and discussion with some mentors and my wife, I determined that I needed to be looking for another job. And so the way it works for pastors is when the time comes, you fill out your profile and all this paperwork, and you submit it to the ELCA, and then it gets passed around to churches that are looking for a new pastor. Shortly after pressing submit on my profile, I began to get phone calls and emails from potential congregations that thought I might be a good fit as their pastor. And soon I had a good list of possible new roles before me, and that's when the trouble started. I wish you could see the pages and pages of notes from my journal at that time in my life. I was constantly perseverating over what decision to make, listing the pros and cons of each congregation, weighing all the options before me. My wife and I had agreed that we would be open to moving, and so there was a church in Ann Arbor, Michigan that I interviewed at. And there was another one in Minneapolis, and another one here in Denver, actually, and another one in Boston. And it was all so exciting and so daunting at the same time. I was going back and forth wondering where I should go, what I should do. It was a very literal crossroads moment with a half dozen forks in the road before me. And I just wanted to make sure that I was picking the absolute number one best choice for me and my family. I'll come back to this story in a second, because the truth is that this is only one way that a crossroads moment can play out in our life. Sometimes it's a whole bunch of forks in a road, but sometimes crossroads are also created when a big, dramatic, singular moment sends our life on an entirely different trajectory. And that's what happened to Abram in that reading from Genesis that we heard read just a few moments ago. We read that Abram was 99 years old when God spoke to him. 99 years old. He must have assumed that his remaining years were going to be spent in the same town, watching daytime television and quietly playing shuffleboard. But then God swoops in and tells him that he has to go to the land where God will send him, and that he will be the father of many nations at 99 years old. Perhaps this was all very exciting to Abram, but maybe this news was a little bit much for a 99-year-old man to take in. A part of me wonders if Abram was actually terrified and overwhelmed by God's pronouncement. That's just the thing about a crossroads moment, though. Regardless of the shape that it takes, they almost always are a moment where things can feel completely overwhelming. For me in 2017, I was totally overwhelmed by trying to figure out the exact correct path for me amongst a multitude of options. And for Abram, after living an entire lifetime, he had his life completely altered in a moment. But that's why what God does next for Abram is so important. God forms a covenant with Abram. God makes him a promise. In other words, God says to Abram, what I'm telling you today can be trusted forever. What I'm telling you today, Abram, can be trusted forever. When we face the crossroads in our life, this is how God speaks to us as well. God will find ways to break in and give us a sense of security, give us a reminder that the future, which in the moment might seem so overwhelming, the future is still a place where God will be. God is with us today in the Crossroads, and God will be with us forever, whatever may come next. I remember back in 2017, when I was overwhelmed trying to figure out what decision to make, I had a mentor remind me that the future is always in God's hands. That's not a guarantee that everything will be perfect, but it means that we don't have to pressure ourselves into trying to figure out the perfectly right decision all the time, because we can trust that God will be with us on whatever path we choose. It's funny because not long after my mentor reminded me of this little detail, my Crossroads suddenly collapsed into focus. You see, one little detail about 2017 that I haven't told you yet is that my wife was pregnant at the time with our third child. And so while my thoughts were filled with ideas about moving across the country to take a new job, there came a point where Amanda and I realized that moving at that particular point in time was crazy. All her doctors were in Philadelphia. Our friends were in Philadelphia. Were we really going to start all over weeks before our third child was born? Suddenly, my long list of potential job options narrowed considerably. And I found myself interviewing and eventually being called to serve as the pastor of a church in Philadelphia that was never on my radar to start out. I had all these ideas about what the future was going to look like, but then what ended up happening was completely different than anything I could have expected. It's a lot like what happens to Peter in the gospel text I read for you just a few minutes ago. Peter hears Jesus talking about going to Jerusalem to die, and so he pulls Jesus aside and he rebukes Jesus, saying that he should not die in Jerusalem. Peter does this because he believes that Jesus is the Messiah. And in Peter's mind, the Messiah is supposed to be a great military leader who goes to Jerusalem not to die, but to destroy Rome and to reestablish Israel as a great global superpower. Peter's vision for the future is nothing like what Jesus will actually end up doing. And this is a very important detail for us, because just like me ending up at that church in Philadelphia, we need to realize that the future might not always play out the way that we had it planned. We might come to a crossroads in our life and choose a path expecting one thing, only to discover that something completely different is playing out. But that doesn't mean that God isn't at work. That doesn't mean that God isn't there on that path with us. My time at the church in Philadelphia was far from perfect. There were struggles and frustrations and heartbreak, but looking back now, I can see so many ways that God was part of that entire unexpected experience. And I'm guessing when you look back and examine the crossroads moments in your life, you can also see the ways that God was continually present. Oftentimes, when we're in the middle of a difficult moment, it's hard to understand what God is doing. We're too overwhelmed or disappointed or sad to think that God could actually be a part of this. But then later on, when we look back at these moments, we can start to see all the ways that God was carrying us and guiding us and loving us through the crossroads. After all, crossroads are first and foremost roads of our life marked by a cross. Jesus travels to Jerusalem to die on a cross so that humanity will know that God is with us in the midst of the most difficult and the very worst. This is how Jesus chose to reveal his power and glory, by dying on a cross. His ultimate mission was to show us that something as overwhelming as death itself is not too much for him to confront. And so that means that your crossroads moment is not too much for Jesus either. If you're overwhelmed by a big decision, or if some vast change has been thrust upon you, or if your world feels undone because of a loss or tragedy, our faith says that these are actually the moments where Jesus promises to show up. Peter wanted Jesus to be the type of Messiah that shows up in military victories, but the truth is, Jesus is the type of Messiah who shows up on a cross. He shows up in our pain. He shows up in overwhelming circumstances. He shows up even in death to carry us through the crossroads. We might not recognize it in the moment, but maybe later we'll be able to see that the love and presence of God was breaking in even then, breaking in when we needed it most. The love and presence of God was with us then, and it will remain with us today, and it will remain with us forever, because that is God's promise. That is how our God works. Amen.